This house stood as a sort of a statement towards design, in the sense that instead of providing this perceived material luxury that is within this mindset, we intended to go for a design where the luxury is not afforded by the materials but by the character of its internal spaces. But because the spaces were the focal point of the design, the materials needed to stay an afterthought. So deep rooted in the mindset of the context is the fact that architecture is a glorified luxury instead of the necessity that it should be, that architecture or again design is substituted by whatever is provided by this sort of rampant builder development that's coming up in these parts of the society.
48 feet by 24 feet. Adjoining to it are 4 more plots of the same size. On the 48 feet length, we have a service road which turns at the rear of the plot. In front of the plot, we have another development of 4 more plots, with the central space being a cul-de-sac and an open ground. Contextually to this, we have the main Najafgarh road on which we have the metro line going on. On the other side of the service lane, we have this small setup called Choti Sabzi Mandi. On all the other sides, we have residential development going on, which is of similar character.
We got 200 square meter plots within adjoining wall. Back in the day, there was a twin housing setup wherein you've got individual ground floors for both the plots. Then a common staircase, half and half, runs through both the houses and leads to an individual first floor for both these houses. Now, because of this, what ended up happening was that we had to leave the common staircase out of our own plot so that it can still cater to the first floor for the house adjacent. Now what happens when we leave this staircase out, instead of a 24 feet length, we get a approximately 21-22 feet length for the front. This gives us a complete square footage of slightly less than 100 square meters, which as per the Delhi bylaws gives us 90% coverage into the entire plot. Now the client initially had a single family bungalow, and it was 2 brothers, and they wanted to raise it to the ground and bring up a single structure with 4 floors, duplexes for 1 for each of the 2 brothers. The client brief was fairly simple. It was a 3-bedroom duplex, 2 duplexes over 4 floors. The house sort of is a very literal rendition of a traditional courtyard house, only it's about a couple of floors above the ground. There's a big Ashoka tree right in front that sort of acts as a visual barrier from the chaotic development all around. There's another small tree that sort of sits right in the middle of this 48 feet length of the house, which in turn again provides us with an added layer of privacy. Based on these 2 green elements, we sort of framed the living area and the courtyard in a way that the most open view that we see is either through the living directly into the Ashoka tree or through the courtyard, which is to the tree right behind the brick wall. The back side of the house, again which faces the service road and further similar construction behind it, the back is also the east face of the house. So to ensure some sort of light from this east end, because that's the morning light, we cut out 2 strip windows and a dead wall in between, and we sort of close off every other view from this face of the house.
The front face, which is the 48 feet length, becomes a key part to designing. We planned all our functions perpendicular to it so that we can take the complete light ventilation from that face. As we enter the house, we have a courtyard, and it is bordered by other functions which are public and semi-private. On one side, we have the living and the dining. On the other side, we have our kitchen.
The kitchen being open is imperative to the layout because the courtyard and the kitchen with this small island jutting into the courtyard becomes one of the main focal pivots for all sorts of interaction.
That forms a part of the courtyard in itself. Behind the kitchen, we have the first bedroom, which has its own dress, and we move further to the washroom. When we see the front side of the plot, we had the dining and the living with a small powder room and a nice double height balcony. We created a small staircase inside the house, which was done in steel to give it that duplex feel. As I move on to the upper deck or the floor, the first place that I land in is our internal balcony, which overlooks the courtyard and is a space which extends the second bedroom that is coming behind into one big space.
Now the balcony again is important from an interaction point of view because it looks directly into the courtyard below, and through the courtyard it looks directly into the living area. So there's this fabric of interaction that runs from the ground floor, from the lower level, through the courtyard and onto the upper level towards the bedroom at the back.
Similar to the floor below, the bedroom has a dress and the washroom. There's a small narrow corridor going into our master bedroom. The master bedroom overlooks into our courtyard, into the drawing dining and the outside.
The master bed also has this full front glazing setup to introduce all sorts of light inside, and there's a small strip of glass floor wherein the master bed glimpses into the living area below. So in essence, the master bedroom from one side of its length can look directly through the courtyard into the kitchen, and the other length glimpses directly into the living.
The space was designed as such that the whole square footage of the master bedroom gives one private space to the user so that it can create a small study and the dress. And from there on, you enter the washroom.
We needed a screen, a porous sort of a system to introduce weather into the house. We knew that brick was a fairly important building block, and we also knew that the screen system had to be fairly customized. We realized that we needed enough privacy within the private functions of the house while allowing some glimpses into the house. The brick wall is this solid 9-inch fly ash setup starting from the ground floor of the house above the stilt up till the terrace level. The brickwork is a traditional jali system, sort of improvised to adapt to the needs of the site. Starting from the east end of the house, and this is how the sun moves along the length of the plot. So now starting from these two private functions of the house, the spacing of the bricks was figured out in a way that we start with a 6 mm spacing. The second brick is 12 mm spacing from the previous one. The next is an 18 mm spacing to peak at the courtyard, where the spacing is about 150 mm, and then gradually go back again with a 144 mm and so forth, closing up at a final 6 mm towards the west edge. The bedrooms and the living area are fairly shaded from the outside. The spacing isn't enough to be able to invade into the privacy of these rooms, but it allows enough light to sort of flood these interior spaces. The courtyard, which is a fairly public sort of a function in the house, gets the most amount of sunlight. When you're crossing by the street and you sort of try to glance into the house, all you get to see is a patch of greens. If this is our solid 9-inch brick wall coming up from the stilt, it was divided into two courses. The first level sits flush with the stilt. The second, the alternate course on top, juts out by about 1.5 inches. The next course again sits flush with the stilt, and and the other one again juts out by an inch and a half. This vertical movement, serves two purposes. One, it accentuates the fact that we need more privacy inside the house. The movement in the bricks coupled with the sequential spacing do that job for us. The second is that this vertical movement also adds another level of intricacy to the entire thing, which allows for a weave-like pattern to be formed onto the brick wall. One of the reasons brick was very important to us to develop this facade was because it's a fairly flexible building material when it comes to adding any length of any amount of porosity in a screen system. Starting from that point on, where we figured that this needed to be a brick wall, we tried to translate that sort of a design ideology towards the inside of the house. We decided to go for a fairly concrete wash into the interiors, and the third underlying material that we ended up using for the project was terrazzo, which was used constantly throughout the length of the floors and in the bathrooms. Being a fairly modest plot size and similarly modest sort of a budget, the architecture was more defined by the need and the function than by aesthetic. The only element added just because for the aesthetic was the coffer ceiling. The triangular coffer sort of breaks the linearity that runs through the length of the house. This triangular pattern translates onto the terrazzo floors as well. The brass strips that run through the floor are an exact replica of the patterns in the coffer on the ceiling. And we decided on adding a gravel bed to the central plantation in the house. So with plantation in the center and a backdrop of this particular brick facade, very light sort of a steel staircase transverses the two floors between this plantation and the brick wall. We finalized on the use of a fairly thin steel plate staircase, a 10 mm steel plate, folded plate staircase, furthering the idea that it has to be a light structure that cannot take away from the backdrop or the foreground. We decided to go with a glass railing. Initially we tried to tie the staircase on both its bordering beams. So there's one beam at the bottom, there's one beam at the top. But steel is a fairly elastic material. So we eventually had to end up giving it some supports. The project is an attempt at introducing architecture in a context that seems intimidated by it. It is an admiration to the luxury afforded by the character of spaces, and it is an homage to the naked materials and their timelessness. Somewhere along the line they started to feel fairly reminiscent of construction, particularly in North India, towards the 1960s and the 1970s. The overall aesthetic of the house felt frozen in time, and that is how the house is subsequently named the house in 1970.